The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured gardens of Kensington Palace as Princess Charlotte walked alongside her governess. At 8 years old, Charlotte had already learned that every step she took was watched. Every word she spoke was measured, and every gesture she made was scrutinized by dozens of eyes. Today felt different, though she couldn't quite explain why. Sergeant James Mitchell stood at attention near the rose garden, his red uniform pristine and his expression carefully neutral. He had been assigned to the Cambridge family security detail for 3 years, and in that time he had witnessed countless formal events, family gatherings, and public appearances. What he had also witnessed, though he would never speak of it openly, were the small moments of genuine childhood that Princess Charlotte fought to preserve despite the weight of royal expectations. The 9-year-old princess had always been observant. Beyond her years, she noticed things that adults often missed. The way her mother's smile sometimes didn't reach her eyes during particularly long public engagements, how her father's jaw tightened when photographers got too close, and most recently, how certain staff members had been acting strangely around the family. 3 weeks earlier, Charlotte had overheard a hushed conversation between 2 housekeeping staff members in the corridor outside her nursery. They spoke in worried whispers about changes coming and new security protocols and something about her grandfather, King Charles, that made their voices drop even lower. When she asked her mother about it later that evening, Catherine had simply smiled and told her not to worry about grown-up matters. But Charlotte did worry. She had inherited her great-grandmother's sharp intelligence and her father's protective instincts. Even at such a young age, she began to notice other things, how her regular bodyguard, Thompson, had been replaced without explanation, how certain family friends had stopped visiting, and how her parents' conversations often stopped abruptly. When she entered a room, Sergeant Mitchell had noticed the princess's increasing anxiety over the past few weeks. Despite strict protocols about maintaining professional distance, he found himself genuinely concerned about the young girl's well-being. He had grown up in a working-class family in Manchester, where children were encouraged to speak their minds and ask questions. The rigid formality of royal life sometimes seemed suffocating, especially for someone as naturally curious and spirited as Princess Charlotte. On this particular morning, as Charlotte walked through the garden with Miss Thompson, she appeared more subdued than usual. Her normally animated chatter was replaced by thoughtful silence, and she kept glancing around as if looking for something or someone. Miss Thompson, a stern woman in her 50s who had previously worked for other aristocratic families, seemed oblivious to the child's mood. Instead, focusing on the day's lessons about proper posture and deportment, the princess stopped suddenly near a fountain, claiming she had dropped her handkerchief. As Miss Thompson bent to retrieve it, Charlotte caught Sergeant Mitchell's eye and did something that made his blood run cold. She placed her hand flat against her throat and drew it across in a quick, subtle motion, a gesture she had learned from watching spy movies with her older brother George. To most observers, it might have looked like she was simply adjusting her collar, but Mitchell recognized it immediately as a distress signal. The sergeant's training kicked in instantly. In his military service in Afghanistan, he had learned to read people and situations quickly. Something was wrong. The princess was trying to communicate that fact without alerting her governess or any potential threats. Who might be watching? His mind raced through possibilities. Was someone threatening her? Had she overheard something she shouldn't have? Was she in immediate danger? Protocol demanded that he maintain his position and report any concerns through proper channels. The chain of command in royal protection was strict and non-negotiable. Any deviation from established procedures could result in immediate dismissal and potentially serious legal consequences. Royal staff members were trained never to act independently, no matter what they observed or suspected. But as Mitchell watched the 8-year-old princess's barely contained fear, protocols suddenly seemed less important than the safety of a child who was clearly trying to tell him something critical. He had taken an oath to protect the royal family, and that protection couldn't be limited by bureaucratic procedures if a member of that family was genuinely in distress. Charlotte continued her walk with Miss Thompson, but kept glancing back at Mitchell with an expression that seemed to say, "Please understand." The sergeant made a decision that would either save a life or end his career. Instead of following standard protocol and reporting to his superior through radio communication, he quietly spoke into his earpiece, requesting permission to approach the princess's party for a routine security check. His supervisor's voice crackled back immediately, denying the request. "Maintain position, Mitchell. No interaction with the principals unless specifically authorized." Mitchell looked at Charlotte again. The child had managed to fall slightly behind her governess and was now making more obvious attempts to get his attention. She pointed discreetly toward the palace's east wing, then looked at him with an expression of such genuine fear that his military instincts overrode his training in royal protocol without another moment's hesitation. Sergeant Mitchell abandoned his post and began walking quickly toward the princess and her governess. As he approached, he could see Miss Thompson's face flush with indignation at this breach of protocol. Royal staff members did not simply walk up to members of the family without permission. Such behavior was not just unprofessional, it was potentially seen as a security threat. "Sergeant, what is the meaning of this?" Miss Thompson demanded, positioning herself protectively in front of Princess Charlotte. "You know very well that you cannot approach Her Royal Highness without proper authorization." But Mitchell's attention was entirely focused on Charlotte. "Your Royal Highness," he said quietly, ignoring Miss Thompson's protests, "is everything all right? Do you need help with something?" The question hung in the air, like a challenge to everything the royal household represented: hierarchy, protocol, and the invisible but unbreakable barriers between those who serve and those who are served. Charlotte looked up at him with relief flooding her young face, and Mitchell knew that whatever consequences awaited him, he had made the right choice. Charlotte's relief was visible, but she glanced nervously at Miss Thompson before speaking. The governess stood rigid with disapproval, clearly preparing to report this breach of protocol to the appropriate authorities. The 8-year-old princess had learned early that speaking freely in front of certain staff members could lead to uncomfortable consequences later. "Miss Thompson," Charlotte said with a polite authority that came naturally to her, "I think I left my reading book in the morning room. Could you please fetch it for me? I promised Mama I would practice my French this afternoon." The governess hesitated, torn between her duty to never leave the princess unattended and her ingrained habit of following Charlotte's requests. "Your Royal Highness, perhaps the sergeant could retrieve your book instead?" "I really shouldn't leave you alone in the garden. It's quite all right," Charlotte replied, using the same tone she had heard her mother use when dismissing staff members politely, but firmly. "Sergeant Mitchell will ensure my safety for the few minutes you'll be gone. Besides, I need to sit quietly for a moment. The walking has made me feel a bit dizzy." Miss Thompson's concern for Charlotte's health overrode her other objections. The governess had been specifically instructed by the Princess of Wales to watch carefully for any signs of illness or distress in young Charlotte, who had been unusually quiet and withdrawn lately. "Of course, Your Royal Highness. I'll return immediately with your book." As soon as Miss Thompson disappeared into the palace, Charlotte turned to Sergeant Mitchell with urgency. "I heard them talking," she whispered, glancing around to make sure they were truly alone. "The new people. The ones who came to work here last week. They said something about Grandpapa that scared me." Mitchell knelt down to Charlotte's eye level, breaking another protocol rule, but making her feel safe enough to continue. "What did you hear, Your Royal Highness?" "And who are these new people?" "They're cleaners, I think. Or maybe they work in the kitchens. I was coming back from my piano lesson when I heard them in the storage room near the music room. They didn't know I was there." Charlotte's voice dropped even lower. "They said something about making sure the king doesn't make it to his appointment next week. They said it would look like an accident." The blood in Mitchell's veins turned to ice. King Charles had a significant public engagement scheduled for the following Tuesday, the opening of a new children's hospital in London. The event had been planned for months and would involve hundreds of people, multiple locations, and complex security arrangements. If someone was planning to harm the king during this event, the implications were staggering. "Did you recognize these people? Had you seen them before?" Mitchell asked, trying to keep his voice calm despite the alarm bells going off in his head. Charlotte shook her head. "I've never seen them before last week. But they're not supposed to be in that part of the palace anyway. That storage room is only for the music staff, and they keep it locked. I only know about it because Mrs. Henderson showed me where she keeps the extra sheet music. Mitchell's mind raced through the security implications. If unauthorized personnel had access to restricted areas of the palace, it suggested either a serious breach in the vetting process or, worse, active collaboration from someone already inside the security system. Either possibility represented a threat not just to the king but to the entire royal family. "Your Royal Highness, this is very important." Did they say anything else? Any names or details about what they were planning? Charlotte closed her eyes, clearly trying to remember exactly what she had heard. They mentioned someone called the Colonel, and they said he would be watching from the hospital. They also talked about a delivery truck and something about the basement entrance. But then they heard footsteps and stopped talking. The details Charlotte provided were specific enough to be credible, but vague enough to make investigation challenging. Mitchell knew he needed to report this information immediately. But he also knew that doing so would raise serious questions about how he had obtained it. Breaking protocol to speak directly with Princess Charlotte was a career-ending offense under normal circumstances. "There's something else," Charlotte continued, looking even more worried. "I think they saw me. When I was leaving, one of them came out of the storage room and looked right at me. He smiled, but it wasn't a nice smile. It made me feel scared." Mitchell felt a chill run down his spine. If potential threats had identified Princess Charlotte as a witness to their conversation, her safety was now in immediate jeopardy. The 8-year-old had stumbled into something far more dangerous than she could understand, and her attempt to do the right thing by reporting it had potentially made her a target. "Has anyone unusual approached you since then? Anyone asked you questions about what you've been doing or where you've been?" "Miss Thompson has been asking me lots of questions about my lessons and what rooms I've been in. But she always asks questions like that. She says it's part of keeping track of my schedule." Charlotte paused, thinking. "But yesterday, one of the new kitchen staff asked me if I enjoyed exploring the palace. I thought it was strange because I'd never talked to him before. And he seemed to know that I sometimes wander around on my own." The pieces were falling into place in Mitchell's mind, and none of them formed a picture he liked. If Charlotte was right about what she had overheard, they were looking at a potential assassination plot against the king. If she was also right about being noticed by the conspirators, she was now in danger herself. And if people within the palace staff were asking unusual questions about her activities, the threat might be closer than anyone realized. Mitchell heard footsteps approaching and quickly stood up. Resuming his professional posture, Miss Thompson appeared around the corner, carrying Charlotte's French reading book and looking relieved to find everything apparently normal in the garden. "Here's your book." "Your Royal Highness," she said, handing it to Charlotte with a small curtsy. "Shall we continue with our walk, or would you prefer to return to the nursery for your lesson?" Charlotte looked at Mitchell one more time, and he gave her the slightest nod, a signal that he understood the gravity of what she had told him and would take appropriate action. "I think I'd like to go inside now, Miss Thompson. I'm feeling quite tired." As the governess led Charlotte toward the palace, Mitchell remained in the garden, his mind working furiously to determine his next move. He had information that could potentially save the king's life, but obtaining that information had required him to violate every protocol that governed his position. He could report what Charlotte had told him, but doing so would inevitably lead to questions about how he had learned it. He could try to investigate discreetly on his own, but his access to palace personnel records and security information was limited. Most troubling of all, he now had to consider the possibility that the normal chains of command might be compromised. If Charlotte was right about what she had heard, and someone with significant access and authority was involved in planning an attempt on the king's life, reporting through normal channels could potentially alert the very people who posed the threat. Mitchell spent the rest of his shift in a state of controlled tension, analyzing every face and every conversation around him with new suspicion. He watched as various staff members went about their daily routines, wondering which of them might be involved in something sinister. The cheerful kitchen assistant who usually waved at him during shift changes, the maintenance workers he passed in the corridors, even some of his fellow security personnel, everyone was now a potential suspect. When his shift ended at 6 o'clock, Mitchell made a decision that would either vindicate Princess Charlotte's concerns or destroy his career permanently. Instead of going home to his small flat in South London, he drove to a quiet pub in Westminster, where he had arranged to meet Detective Inspector Sarah Walsh. An old friend from his army days who now worked in the Metropolitan Police's special branch. Walsh arrived 20 minutes later. Still wearing her work clothes and looking curious about Mitchell's urgent but cryptic phone call, they had served together in Afghanistan, where her skills in intelligence analysis had been invaluable during several dangerous operations. If anyone could help him navigate the delicate situation he found himself in, it was Sarah. "This better be good, James," she said, sliding into the booth across from him. "I had to cancel dinner plans with my sister to meet you here. What's so urgent that you couldn't tell me over the phone?" Mitchell looked around the nearly empty pub, ensuring they wouldn't be overheard. "I need your advice about something, Sarah. Something that could be very serious, but could also get me arrested for treason if I'm wrong about it." Walsh's expression immediately became more serious. Her years in Special Branch had taught her to recognize when someone was genuinely concerned about national security issues versus when they were simply paranoid or attention-seeking. Mitchell's tone and body language suggested the former. "I am listening," she said simply. Mitchell spent the next 20 minutes carefully explaining what Princess Charlotte had told him. How she had communicated her distress, and why he believed her account was credible, despite her young age. He also described his growing concerns about security protocols at the palace, and his suspicion that normal reporting channels might be compromised. Walsh listened without interruption, occasionally asking clarifying questions about timing, locations, and personnel. When Mitchell finished, she sat quietly for several minutes, processing the information and considering its implications. "The details about the hospital basement entrance are specific enough to be concerning," she finally said. "And the timing aligns with what I know about the king's schedule. But James, you realize what you're asking me to do, don't you? You want me to investigate potential threats against the royal family based on a conversation overheard by an 8-year-old child?" "I know how it sounds," Mitchell replied, "but Charlotte isn't an ordinary 8-year-old. She's been raised in an environment where observation and discretion are survival skills. She notices things that most adults would miss, and she understands the importance of what she sees and hears." Walsh nodded slowly. "Assuming you're right about the princess's credibility, we still have several problems. First, any investigation into palace security would require approval from levels far above my authority. Second, if there really is a conspiracy involving palace staff, then starting an official investigation could alert the conspirators and accelerate their timeline. And third, your career in royal protection is essentially over the moment this becomes official, regardless of whether the threat is real or not." Mitchell had already considered all of these points, but hearing them stated so bluntly reinforced the gravity of his situation. "What would you do in my position?" "Honestly, I'd try to gather more concrete evidence before involving official channels. The conversation Charlotte overheard is concerning, but it's not enough to trigger a full-scale security review. We need names, faces, specifics about the planned method and timing. Without those details, any investigation will be too broad to be effective and too visible to be safe." Walsh leaned forward, lowering her voice even further. "But if you're determined to pursue this, I can make some discreet inquiries about recent personnel changes at the palace. I can also check whether there have been any unusual security incidents or concerns raised by other staff members. It's not much, but it might give us a better sense of whether Charlotte stumbled onto something real or simply misunderstood an innocent conversation." Agreed that Walsh would spend the next day making careful inquiries, while Mitchell tried to observe palace activities more closely, particularly around the areas Charlotte had mentioned. They also established a communication protocol that would allow them to share information without creating a traceable record of their investigation. The following morning, Mitchell arrived at the palace earlier than usual and took a route through the building that would allow him to observe the music room area where Charlotte had overheard the suspicious conversation. The storage room she had mentioned was indeed in a restricted area, accessible only to authorized personnel with specific key cards. As he passed through the corridor, he noticed 2 men in maintenance uniforms working near the music room door. Neither of them looked familiar, and their work seemed to involve installing some kind of electronic equipment rather than routine maintenance. When they saw him approaching, they quickly packed up their tools and moved away. Claiming they were finished with their work, Mitchell made a mental note of their faces and continued his patrol. But the encounter reinforced his growing conviction that Princess Charlotte had indeed witnessed something significant. The fact that unauthorized personnel were working in restricted areas, combined with their evasive behavior when questioned, suggested that security protocols were being systematically compromised. Later that morning, he observed Charlotte during her scheduled garden time with Miss Thompson. The 8-year-old princess looked pale and tired, and she kept glancing nervously at palace windows, as if expecting to see someone watching her. When she caught sight of Mitchell, she gave him a small, anxious smile that seemed to ask whether he had taken action on the information she had provided. Mitchell wished he could reassure her, but protocol prevented any direct communication. Instead, he could only hope that his investigation with Walsh would either uncover the truth behind what Charlotte had heard or prove that her fears were unfounded. Either outcome would be preferable to the current situation where a child was living in fear and potentially real threats were going unaddressed. His radio crackled to life, interrupting his thoughts. "Mitchell, report to the security office immediately. Inspector Davies wants to see you." As Mitchell walked toward the security office, a cold dread settled in his stomach. Inspector Davies was the head of palace security, a man known for his strict adherence to protocol and his intolerance for any deviation from established procedures. If Davies wanted to see him, it could only mean that someone had reported his unauthorized interaction with Princess Charlotte. The previous day, the question was whether this summons was simply about disciplinary action for breaking protocol, or whether it indicated something more sinister. If Davies was involved in the conspiracy Charlotte had overheard, then Mitchell's investigation had just become infinitely more dangerous. Mitchell's walk to the security office felt like a march to his execution. The corridors of Kensington Palace, which had become familiar and comfortable over his 3 years of service, now seemed threatening and full of hidden dangers. Every staff member he passed could potentially be part of the conspiracy. Every security camera could be recording evidence of his unauthorized investigation. Inspector Davies was waiting for him in the main security office, a windowless room filled with monitors showing feeds from dozens of cameras throughout the palace grounds. Davies was a man in his late 50s, the gray hair and the ramrod straight posture of someone who had spent decades in military service before transitioning to royal protection. His expression was unreadable as Mitchell entered and stood at attention. "Sergeant Mitchell," Davies said, without looking up from the paperwork on his desk, "it's come to my attention that you broke protocol yesterday by approaching Princess Charlotte without authorization. Would you care to explain your actions?" Mitchell had prepared for this moment, but he still felt his heart racing as he considered his response. Too much honesty could expose Charlotte to danger and reveal his ongoing investigation. Too little could make him appear evasive and untrustworthy. He decided to stay as close to the truth as possible, while omitting the most sensitive details. "Sir, I observed that Her Royal Highness appeared to be in distress during her garden walk. She seemed unwell, and I was concerned for her immediate safety. I felt that conducting a welfare check was consistent with my primary duty to protect the royal family." Davies finally looked up from his paperwork. Studying Mitchell's face with the sharp eyes of someone trained to detect deception, the princess appeared to be in distress. "That's interesting, Sergeant. Miss Thompson reported no such distress in her daily log. In fact, she described Princess Charlotte as being in perfectly normal spirits throughout their walk." The contradiction was troubling. Either Miss Thompson had failed to notice Charlotte's obvious anxiety, or she was deliberately misrepresenting the situation in her reports. Given what Charlotte had told him about the governess's unusual questioning lately, Mitchell was beginning to suspect the latter. "Perhaps Miss Thompson and I observed different aspects of Her Royal Highness's behavior, sir. I was positioned at some distance and may have noticed subtle signs that weren't apparent to someone walking directly beside her." Davies nodded slowly, as if accepting this explanation, but his next question caught Mitchell off guard. "Tell me, Sergeant, what do you know about the King's upcoming visit to the Children's Hospital?" The question seemed innocent enough, but the timing made Mitchell's blood run cold. Why would Davies be asking him about the King's schedule immediately after questioning him about his interaction with Princess Charlotte? Was this a test to see what he knew, or was Davies attempting to determine whether Charlotte had shared sensitive information with him? I'm aware that His Majesty has a public engagement scheduled for next Tuesday, sir. Beyond that, I haven't been briefed on specific security arrangements since my assignment is focused on the Cambridge family rather than the King's protective detail. It's quite right, Davies replied. But I'm sure you understand that security for any royal engagement involves coordination between all protective units. I've been reviewing personnel assignments for next week. I'm considering transferring you temporarily to assist with the King's security detail. Mitchell felt a chill of recognition. If Davies was involved in the conspiracy Charlotte had overheard, then placing Mitchell on the King's security detail would serve two purposes. It would remove him from Charlotte's vicinity, preventing any further unauthorized communication between them. More ominously, it could potentially make him a scapegoat if something went wrong during the King's public appearance. Of course, sir. I'm available for whatever assignment serves the family's security needs best. Davies smiled, but it was the same cold, calculating an expression that Charlotte had described seeing from the man who noticed her near the storage room. Excellent. Report to Briefing Room 3 at 800 hours on Monday morning for your reassignment orientation. Inspector Williams will provide you with the specific details of your new duties. As Mitchell prepared to leave, Davies called him back. Oh, and Sergeant. In the future, any concerns about the welfare of family members should be reported through proper channels rather than addressed directly. I'm sure you understand the importance of maintaining appropriate boundaries. Understood, sir? Mitchell left the security office with his mind racing. The timing of his reassignment was too convenient to be coincidental. If Davies was genuinely concerned about protocol violations, the appropriate response would have been a formal reprimand or additional training, not a transfer to one of the most sensitive security details in the Royal Protection Service. He spent the rest of his shift trying to appear normal while observing everything around him with heightened awareness. During his lunch break, he sent a coded text message to Sarah Walsh, indicating that they needed to meet urgently. Her response came back within minutes, suggesting they meet at a different location than their usual spot. That evening, Mitchell found Walsh waiting for him in a small cafe in Camden, far from the usual haunts of palace staff or government officials. She looked tense and tired, which immediately told him that her own inquiries had uncovered something significant. You were right to be concerned, she said, without preamble as soon as he sat down. I've found some very troubling patterns in recent personnel changes at the palace. In the past 6 weeks, 17 new staff members have been hired across various departments. That's unusual in itself. But what's more concerning is that several of them appear to have falsified references and employment histories. Walsh pulled out a small notebook and showed him a list of names and positions. 3 of these people claim to have worked for catering companies that went out of business years ago. 2 others have references from cleaning services that don't appear to exist. The background checks that should have caught these discrepancies were signed off by someone in the security office, but the signatures don't match any authorized personnel. Mitchell studied the list, recognizing some of the names as people he had seen around the palace recently. What about their current assignments? Are any of them working in areas that would give them access to the King's security arrangements? That's where it gets really concerning. Several of them are assigned to work in the same building where the security briefings are held. Others have been given access to areas that would normally require much higher clearance levels. Someone with significant authority has been systematically placing these people in positions where they could gather intelligence about royal movements and security procedures. Walsh leaned forward, lowering her voice. James, I think you and Princess Charlotte have stumbled onto something much bigger than a single assassination attempt. This looks like a comprehensive infiltration of palace security. If I'm right, then everyone currently in the chain of command is potentially compromised. The implications were staggering. If the conspiracy involved multiple levels of palace security, then not only was the king in immediate danger, but the entire royal family could be at risk. More immediately, Mitchell realized that his reassignment to the king's security detail could be part of a plan to place him at the scene of an assassination attempt, possibly as a patsy. There's something else, Walsh continued. I did some checking on Inspector Davies. His military record is exemplary, and his service with royal protection has been without incident until recently. But in the past 3 months, he's made several unexplained trips to Ireland and has been meeting regularly with people who aren't in any official government databases. Mitchell felt the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. He's transferring me to the King's security detail for Monday morning. At the time, I thought it was suspicious timing, but now I think it might be part of their plan. Walsh nodded grimly. If they're planning to make the King's death look like a security failure, they'd need someone to blame. A sergeant who recently broke protocol and had unauthorized contact with a member of the royal family would be a perfect candidate for a scapegoat. They sat in silence for several moments, both contemplating the full scope of what they were facing. Finally, Walsh spoke again. We need to make contact with someone we can trust completely. Someone with the authority to take action, but who definitely isn't part of this conspiracy. Do you have any ideas? Mitchell thought carefully about Walsh's question. In his 3 years of service, he had observed the complex web of relationships and hierarchies that governed palace life. Most of the senior security officials reported through Davies or had worked closely with him for years. Going to any of them could potentially alert the conspiracy and accelerate whatever timeline they were working toward. There's Colonel Harrison, Mitchell said slowly. He's the liaison between royal protection and military intelligence. I've only met him a few times, but his reputation is solid, and he reports directly to Downing Street rather than through palace channels. More importantly, he wasn't involved in any of the recent personnel decisions that brought the suspicious staff members into the palace. Walsh nodded thoughtfully. I know Harrison by reputation. He's old-school military intelligence, very by the book but also very effective. The challenge is getting to him without going through normal channels and convincing him to take action based on what we have so far. What if we could get more concrete evidence first? Mitchell asked. If I'm going to be transferred to the King's detail anyway, maybe I can use that position to observe their actual plans. If I can document specific threats or identify the exact method they're planning to use, Harrison would have to take us seriously. Walsh shook her head firmly. That's too dangerous. If they're planning to use you as a scapegoat, then putting you in the middle of their operation could be exactly what they want. Besides, if something goes wrong, you'll either be dead or in prison for treason. They were interrupted by Walsh's phone buzzing with an urgent message. She read it quickly, and her expression became even more grim. James, we may be out of time for subtle investigations. I just got word that the King's hospital visit has been moved up. It's now scheduled for tomorrow afternoon instead of Tuesday. Mitchell felt his stomach drop. That's impossible. Security arrangements for royal visits take weeks to finalize. You can't just move a public engagement like that with 24 hours notice. Unless someone with significant authority specifically requested the change, Walsh replied. And unless the change is designed to create exactly the kind of security, gaps that would allow an assassination attempt to succeed. The shortened timeline meant that whatever plan the conspirators had developed was now in motion. It also meant that Mitchell's reassignment briefing on Monday morning was irrelevant. The King would already be dead by then. And Mitchell would be perfectly positioned to take the blame for security failures that led to the assassination. We have to contact Colonel Harrison tonight, Mitchell said urgently. Even if our evidence isn't perfect, we can't wait for more confirmation. If we're right about what's happening, tomorrow afternoon will be too late. Walsh pulled out her phone and began typing rapidly. I'm sending an encrypted message through special branch channels requesting an emergency meeting with Harrison. I'll tell him it's a matter of national security involving potential threats to the royal family. That should get his attention. While Walsh worked on contacting Harrison, Mitchell's mind turned to Princess Charlotte. If the conspiracy was moving ahead of schedule, and her value as a witness to their plans had become both more important and more dangerous. The 8-year-old had shown remarkable courage in communicating her concerns to him, but she was still a child in a palace full of adults who might wish her harm. Sarah, what about Charlotte? If these people know she overheard their conversation, her safety could be in immediate danger, especially if they're accelerating their timeline. Walsh looked up from her phone with concern. You're right, but we can't warn the family without revealing our investigation. And if we're wrong about who can be trusted, warning them could actually put Charlotte in more danger. Mitchell felt frustrated by their limited options, but he also knew that Walsh was right. Until they had official support for their investigation, Any action they took could backfire catastrophically. What if something happens to her while we're waiting for Colonel Harrison to respond? Then we'll deal with that when it happens, Walsh said firmly. But right now, our best chance of protecting everyone is to stop this conspiracy before it can hurt anyone. Her phone buzzed with an incoming message. She read it quickly, then looked at Mitchell with relief. Harrison will meet with us in 2 hours. Westminster Bridge, South Side. He wants to keep this completely unofficial until he understands what we're dealing with. They spent the next 90 minutes reviewing all the evidence they had gathered and preparing a concise presentation for Harrison. Mitchell also used the time to think through everything he had observed at the palace over the past few days, looking for additional details that might support their case. As they walked toward Westminster Bridge, Mitchell couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Several times he noticed the same faces in crowds or saw cars that seemed to be following them. Whether this was paranoia brought on by stress or genuine surveillance, he couldn't be sure. But it added to his sense that time was running out. Colonel Harrison was waiting for them at the designated meeting spot. A tall man in his 60s wearing a civilian overcoat, but carrying himself with unmistakable military bearing. He listened without interruption as Walsh and Mitchell presented their evidence, occasionally asking sharp questions that demonstrated both his intelligence background and his healthy skepticism. When they finished, Harrison stood quietly for several minutes, looking out at the Thames while he processed what he had heard. Finally, he turned back to them with a grave expression. What you're describing sounds like a sophisticated infiltration operation, possibly backed by a foreign intelligence service. The level of coordination and the depth of penetration into palace security suggests resources and planning far beyond what a domestic terrorist group could manage. Harrison pulled out his own encrypted phone and began typing. I'm activating emergency protocols that will put additional security around all members of the royal family immediately. I'm also ordering a complete lockdown of the palace while we investigate these personnel irregularities. Mitchell felt a wave of relief, but Harrison's next words brought him back to reality. However, implementing these measures will almost certainly alert the conspirators that we're onto them. If they're planning something for tomorrow, they may accelerate their timeline even further, or they may abandon this plan in favor of something we're not prepared for. The colonel looked directly at Mitchell. Sergeant, you're in a unique position. Your scheduled reassignment gives you a legitimate reason to be involved in security planning for the king's visit. If you're willing to take the risk, you could potentially help us identify the specific threat and the people involved. Sir, that's exactly what we were trying to avoid. If something goes wrong, Mitchell will be in an impossible position. Harrison nodded. I understand the risk, Detective Inspector. But if we're right about the scope of this conspiracy, then conventional security measures may not be sufficient. We need someone on the inside who can observe and report in real time. Mitchell looked between Walsh and Harrison, knowing that his decision in the next few moments could determine not just his own fate, but possibly the survival of the monarchy itself. The 8-year-old princess, who had trusted him enough to signal for help, deserved better than adults who were too cautious to act on her warning. I'll do it, Mitchell said without hesitation. Princess Charlotte risked her safety to warn me about what she heard. The least I can do is see this through to protect her and her family. Harrison nodded approvingly. Very well. Here's what we're going to do. Walsh, I want you to coordinate with Special Branch to begin discreet surveillance of the suspicious personnel we've identified. Don't move to arrest anyone yet, but document their movements and communications. Mitchell, you'll attend your reassignment briefing as scheduled, but you'll be wearing a wire that will allow us to monitor everything that happens. The colonel handed Mitchell a small device that looked like an ordinary shirt button. This is military-grade surveillance equipment. It will transmit everything you see and hear directly to our monitoring station. If you find yourself in immediate danger, say the phrase, I need to contact my supervisor, and we'll extract you immediately. Over the next several hours, they worked out the details of Mitchell's undercover role. He would attend the briefing, gather as much information as possible about the assassination plan, try to identify all the conspirators involved. Meanwhile, Brasson would position counterintelligence teams around the hospital and prepare rapid response units that could intervene if necessary. The following morning, Mitchell reported to the palace briefing room with a mixture of determination and terror. He had spent most of the night awake, running through possible scenarios and trying to prepare for whatever he might face. The tiny recording device hidden in his uniform felt both reassuring and dangerous. It was his lifeline to Harrison's team. But it would also be evidence of his betrayal if the conspirators discovered it. Inspector Davies was waiting in the briefing room, along with 6 other men, 3 of whom Mitchell recognized as members of the suspicious personnel Walsh had identified. The atmosphere in the room was tense and businesslike. With none of the casual conversation that usually preceded security briefings, gentlemen, Davies began without preamble. Today's operation requires absolute precision and complete discretion. Any deviation from the plan we're about to discuss will result in immediate consequences for everyone involved. As Davies outlined the security arrangements for the King's hospital visit, Mitchell began to understand the true scope of the conspiracy. The plan wasn't simply to assassinate the King, it was to do so in a way that would destroy public confidence in the monarchy and potentially trigger a constitutional crisis. The explosion will occur in the hospital's basement, Davies explained. Pointing to architectural drawings spread across the table, it will be timed to coincide with His Majesty's arrival at the children's ward, ensuring maximum symbolic impact. The official investigation will conclude that security failures allowed terrorists to place explosive devices in the building. One of the suspicious staff members raised his hand. What about civilian casualties? The hospital will be full of sick children and their families. Davies's response was chillingly matter-of-fact. Collateral damage is unavoidable in operations of this magnitude. The symbolic value of the target outweighs other considerations. Mitchell felt sick listening to these men discuss the murder of innocent children with the same detached professionalism they might use to plan a military exercise. He forced himself to remain calm and continue gathering information. Knowing that Harrison's team was listening to every word, Mitchell Davies said, turning to him suddenly, "Your role will be to ensure that the King reaches the basement level at exactly 14:30 hours. You'll suggest that he inspect the hospital's new medical equipment storage area as part of his tour. The explosion will occur at 14:32, giving you just enough time to be clear of the immediate blast zone." The plan was diabolical in its simplicity. Mitchell would be positioned as the lone survivor of a terrorist attack, able to provide testimony that would support whatever narrative the conspirators wanted to establish. His recent protocol violation with Princess Charlotte would be presented as evidence that security standards had become dangerously lax, justifying wholesale changes in royal protection procedures. "What about the investigation afterwards?" Mitchell asked, trying to sound like a willing participant. "Won't there be questions about how the explosives were placed?" One of the other conspirators answered. "The devices are already in position, placed by maintenance staff over the past 2 weeks. The triggering mechanism will be activated remotely, and the signal will be untraceable. Physical evidence will be destroyed in the blast, and the timing will point to an external terrorist organization." The briefing continued. Mitchell learned that the conspiracy extended far beyond the palace staff. It involved elements within Parliament who wanted to reduce the monarchy's constitutional role, foreign intelligence operatives who sought to destabilize British institutions, and financial interests who would profit from the chaos that would follow the King's assassination. Princess Charlotte's overheard conversation had uncovered just the tip of an iceberg that threatened the foundation of British government. The 8-year-old's courage in reporting what she had heard might have prevented not just an assassination, but a carefully orchestrated coup attempt. The briefing concluded with Davies distributing final instructions and security credentials that would give each conspirator access to different areas of the hospital. As the men filed out of the room, Davies pulled Mitchell aside for a private conversation. "I want you to understand, Sergeant, that what we're doing today serves a greater purpose than protecting one man's life. The monarchy has become an outdated institution that stands in the way of real democratic progress. Sometimes History requires decisive action to move forward. Mitchell nodded, playing his role as a loyal follower, while fighting the urge to arrest Davies on the spot. I understand, sir. What happens after today? After today? You'll be a hero who survived a terrorist attack while protecting the king. Your testimony will be crucial in reshaping how royal security operates in the future. There will be promotions, commendations, and opportunities for advancement beyond anything you could achieve in normal circumstances. As Mitchell left the palace and headed toward the hospital, he spoke quietly into his hidden microphone. Harrison, did you get all that? The explosion is scheduled for 1432 in the basement level. I'm heading to the hospital now to try to prevent the king from entering the building. Harrison's voice came back through his nearly invisible earpiece. Confirmed, Mitchell. Bomb disposal teams are already en route to the hospital. Counterintelligence units are moving to arrest the conspirators we can identify. You've done excellent work, but your part in this operation is now finished. Do not attempt to intercept the king yourself. Leave that to our teams. But as Mitchell approached the hospital, he could see the king's motorcade arriving ahead of schedule. Royal protection officers were already escorting His Majesty toward the building entrance, following a route that would take them directly to the basement level, where the explosives were waiting. Harrison's teams might not arrive in time to prevent the assassination, and the king was walking unknowingly toward his death. Mitchell had a choice to make: follow orders and trust that others would handle the situation, or break protocol one more time to save a life. He thought of Princess Charlotte's brave signal in the garden, her willingness to trust him with information that could have put her in danger. The 8-year-old had shown more courage than many adults, twice her age, and she deserved to grow up in a world where such bravery was rewarded, not ignored. Mitchell began running toward the hospital entrance, knowing that this decision would either save the monarchy or cost him everything he had worked for. Either way, he was determined that Princess Charlotte's warning would not be in vain.